Okay, let's get started. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Kevin Smith. I am the How the Market Works and Personal Finance Lab project manager. I've been working with high schools for 5 years now, building stock games, budgeting games, and some other activities for personal finance, economics, business, and several other subjects. So this webinar is going to cover the stuff that we basically find works best in classes. So what drives the best student engagement, what has been historically what solidifies lessons best, and generally speaking, how you get the most out of using a stock game. I'm going to next talk about our Personal Finance Lab site, what it is, what resources are available, and a little bit of information about our new budgeting game that we're releasing, along with some best practices from the first teachers who've been using that in their classes. So to start out, as I just said, my name is Kevin Smith. I'm the high school project manager at Stock-Trak. That's the parent company above How the Market Works. I have a master's in economics. I'm working in a second one in public administration. I work with several of the state councils on economic education on their stock games. Across all of our sites, we work with between 15,000 and 20,000 high school teachers each year running their own separate stock games. And somewhere around 500,000 students. So I spend a lot of time doing analysis on classes. We do surveys every semester to talk to both teachers and students about what they found works, what doesn't work for them, some of the best practices for other teachers to apply for their classes. I also work with several nonprofit organizations to develop guidelines for high school stock games and best practices, and develop some curriculum to go along with stock games. So this is kind of an evolving field, actually. Stock games have actually been around for almost 30 years now, but the way they're being used in schools has been transforming pretty rapidly over the last few years. A lot of that is being driven by technology. You can just do more with stock games than you could before, depending on how you're structuring your classroom. But a lot of it is just, more teachers are doing it, so there's a lot more creativity coming into what's being done. So, let's start out with some universal best practices. So every teacher who uses a stock game should follow these pretty closely. The first and foremost for every stock game is the best results come when you can start your game earlier in the semester and end it later in the semester. A 10-week game is kind of the golden rule for what a lot of schools work with, but we work with some schools that actually start almost the first week of classes and go all the way into the last week of classes. We have some schools that actually have it go on for year-long challenges. And the big reason to do this is that the markets themselves are pretty volatile, but students seeing a little short-term swing on their portfolio doesn't have a big impact. They get the most out of it when they're actually able to apply concepts over a longer period of time. More things happen in the real world that impact their stock game. It gives them a chance to react to something that's happening in the news. And the shorter stock games just don't get that same exposure. For example, we work with a lot of schools that right at the end of the semester, they'll do like a 2-week stock game just as kind of a capstone when they're talking in a personal finance class. And that's okay. It does introduce students to the concepts of buying a stock, but it doesn't have the same impact where a student understands how the real world is impacting their portfolio. It doesn't have that same impact where students need to consider how things are moving over time, where a shock can happen that has a big impact on the class rankings. Those kinds of things are the real teaching moments. Which actually leads us right into the second point. The rankings on your stock game are a big deal. This is often one of the most engaging parts of using a stock game in a personal finance or an economics class, because the real-time rankings in the stock game is basically what keeps the students engaged. The biggest flurry of trading is usually coming up in the first week or two of classes when students are first building their portfolios. But then when they see their class ranking move up and down, that's what prompts students to actually get back in there, figure out why they're doing better or worse than everybody else, and then keep adjusting their portfolios accordingly. So again, the rankings connect it to the news. It connects the students to each other. It keeps that element of competition. So generally speaking, teachers should embrace that and also bring up the rankings when they're talking about their class frequently. Which also relates to the next point. Teachers that trade too generally get about a 30% increase in their class engagement with the stock game. So this means if you're the teacher and you create your own custom contest or something on the How the Market Works stock game, you should also be building a portfolio in trading. You should be in the rankings, because then it becomes kind of a game of, can I beat the teacher, rather than just, can I beat everybody else? It really helps quite a bit in keeping everybody engaged. And when you do want to bring up those class rankings as part of the class, just to keep everybody on top of things, it's a good point to make. How many students are beating the teacher, how many aren't? That has a pretty big impact on the way the students perceive the game. Last one is kind of a nitty-gritty of the tournament rules that you would have for your class. If you can, allow day trading and short selling. These are two rules that historically were not used a lot of times because teachers don't like to encourage day trading, and a lot of teachers may or may not understand how short selling works as a mechanic. But when it comes to actually driving engagement, both of these are pretty good to have turned on. Allowing day trading gives students the opportunity to react to market news in a lot in real time, basically. So if you have a class period where students are spending, an hour or so where they have access to their portfolios, if you allow day trading, they can buy something and then change their mind later in the class. And that's not a bad thing. Generally speaking, students who day trade underperform students who use a buy and hold strategy, which is also a great teachable moment. But the same thing with short selling. Short selling is where students have the ability to short a stock, and so they actually profit when that stock's price falls. And this really opens up a whole other side of investing, where students can be identifying not just companies they're going to think are doing well, but they can also be identifying companies that they think are doing poorly, and include that as part of their investing strategy. So, going in both directions is good. They want to be able to identify both cases in the real world. So both of those help a lot with just driving how much students can engage with it. And classes that follow these typically have students that get a lot more into the stock games than others. The next biggest thing is using assignments. So on our How the Market Works website, we have assignments built into our class, or our stock game. And the concept behind an assignment is that students have tutorial videos and articles that go alongside the stock game itself. So if you've used a How the Market Works site this semester, you will notice that you're prompted to actually create an assignment right when you set up your first class. You can have as many assignments as you want, but these go a long way with A, making sure your students get started on the right foot, and B, keeping them engaged with the game over time. So if I pull up my class assignments on my stock game that I've set up already, this is basically what it would look like. You would create an assignment. These first 10 things that we have here is the stuff that we recommend for every single class, because this is stuff that takes a student from not knowing a single thing about investing to be able to actually use the stock game and place their first trade. So articles like what is a stock? The articles that we have are between 1,000 and 2,000 words. They're mostly written at about an 8th grade reading level, some of them a little bit lower. We use images, we use infographics, we use videos, and they all end with a pop quiz. And students need to take this quiz in order to get credit for having read the article. So this is another thing that whenever you have class time dedicated to the stock game, you can have a couple other activities that students do alongside their trading. So these 10 are the first ones just to introduce them to using the site. There's more of them talking about mutual funds and things, and there's a bunch of stuff talking about personal finance topics, filing taxes, reading an income statement, a credit card payment calculator, that kind of thing. So using the assignments is a really good way to also connect the stock game back to the other stuff you're talking about in class. Your investments unit, unless you're actually a securities and investing teacher, is not going to last the whole semester. But by using the assignments tool, you can keep connecting these concepts back to what's going on in the stock game and keep that competitive edge and keep students engaged with it. The other types of assignments that you can use, like I said, there's the beginner's one up here, 10 items. This usually takes about half an hour for students to finish, and this is usually what you would have your students do for the first day that you'd be using the stock game. Elementary and middle school stuff, you kind of make it a little bit more basic for younger students. These are just little short videos with quizzes. Intermediate stuff, this is usually the second day of classes or the first day of your investing unit if you're coming in later. This is things like mutual funds, ETFs, and then some more tutorial videos on how to use them in their portfolio. Along with this really important one about the research tools. So how can they look up a stock quote? How do they read a stock chart? That kind of thing is covered in here. Some other stuff that we have is our mathematics section. The mathematics section actually is more about using spreadsheets. So how students can, for example, take their How the Market Works portfolio data, bring it into Excel or Google Sheets, calculate some kind of variable, so understanding how to use the data a little bit. We also go into graphing and things like that too. For personal finance topics, there's about 30 topics in here covering a wide range of personal finance concepts. So the idea here is you can create as many assignments as you like. So you'd create one usually week by week, and then you'd pick out the topics in here that line up with what you're talking about in class. Same thing that goes with the economic stuff. We have a few business and accounting things, and we also have some career prep. So the career prep stuff talks about things like certifications, using our job search tool to find real jobs and internships to build a career plan, things like that. And then the cornerstone stuff is basics trades. So you can actually mandate your students come in and place 3 trades each week. Just something to make sure they keep engaged with the portfolio, even if the rankings themselves aren't doing that for them. This is also coupled with trade notes. So trade notes is a tool in the How the Market Works stock game. You can mandate that your students take notes with every trade. So for example, when I go in my portfolio and actually try to place my first trade here, students can just start typing a company name to get symbols that match, and I pick one I want. But before I can actually place this order, the system is going to prompt me to enter a note down here. So why are they doing this? You as the teacher can see all of your students' trade notes. Your students can have a record of them for what they've posted, but they can't change them. So they can't come back with hindsight and then change the reason why they do that. So by default on the system, they're all optional, but we highly recommend that every class make them mandatory. That way the student is putting their justification in, and you can actually mandate they relate their trades back to topics that they're going through in other classes. So if you're talking about insurance, for example, you can say that you should go buy an insurance stock this week, just so they understand what those companies look like. Yeah, so this is the main 2 things when it comes to the stuff that every class should have. The longer the periods, make a big deal of the rankings, use the assignments, and use the trade notes. Some of the other stuff that you can do, it depends on your specific class. There's pros and cons in each direction. The idea here is, the first one, for example, is starting cash. How much money should you give your students to start with? So there's basically 2 schools of thought, depending on the teachers that we talk to. One of them is the $100,000 camp, or even higher, $1 million. This is the oldest form. The $100,000 game is what's been held by most of the councils on economic education as part of a lot of statewide competitions. It makes the math easy for students. They can divide $100,000 pretty easily to get percentages. There's lots of room for them to make new strategies, so they can buy a lot of different stocks if they want to. And let students think big. So they have $100,000, here's what you can do with it. I know a lot of business people who believe that there's a lot of people in the world who you're only going to see their potential if you give them responsibility. If they don't have that responsibility, they're just never going to step up to the plate. So the $100,000 one goes along that same line of thinking. You may not, for a student who may not be shining elsewhere, if you actually give them $100,000 to play around with, they take it very seriously. The biggest cons for the $100,000 games is it's not very realistic for the students. This can be a bigger deal, especially in rural communities and schools that aren't necessarily college prep focused. If $100,000 is more than a student can really conceptualize, then they can kind of get lost in when they get set up with the game. The lessons they would be learning about investing are less applied because it just comes down to they think of it as a rich man's game. So that's not something that we want to do. Getting started also takes a lot more time with the $100,000 game. $100,000 is a lot of money for a student to allocate. Most schools will have their students pick 4 or 5 stocks to start out with, but We also find that in practice, most students will go in and buy 10 or 15 shares of those 4 or 5 companies and still have 90% of their cash left over. And they have to come back later and then start reinvesting it and then rebalancing their portfolio. It takes a longer time to actually get the class spun up to fully engaged. Now, on the other side, there's the $1,000 game, or a $5,000 game, or some smaller amount of money. So this one, the pros of it is it's really easy for students to grasp. Most students, if you ask them, think that they'd be able to save $1,000 if they had a job within a year. So this is a tangible amount of money. So when it comes to actually applying what they learned in the real world, they're more likely to remember what went on, because this is something that they finish it in the class and then they want to jump into it in the real world. I just got a question. Do you find the amount of time you are going to play the game dictates which amount of money to start with? Generally speaking, no. The length of the game doesn't have a huge impact on how much money you give them, because at the end of the day, everything's by percentages. The class ranking is just a percent of return you've had on the money you started with. So there's not really a correlation between the length of the game and which amount of money works best. I actually am going to talk about that at the very end when I'm talking about the new things that we're working on, because we actually have a middle ground that we're trying to develop. The other pros of the starting cash is that it makes the math more challenging. So this is actually the opposite of the pro on the other side. If you have smaller cash, it makes the math harder for students because you can't divide it very easily. And a share of Amazon stock, for example, costs about $1,700. So if you start them out with $1,000, they can't buy it at all. If they start out with $2,000, they can buy one share. So when it comes to actually allocating the portfolio between stocks, it becomes more challenging, because they can't just divide 100,000 by 1,000 to get a round number. So they have to think about that a little bit more. Anecdotally, the students with less cash remember more. So this is just coming off of the teacher survey data. We have not surveyed students themselves for this, just because there's lots of reasons we don't like to collect student personal information. But the concept here is that teachers find when students are faced with restrictions, they're more creative in how they approach it. That's not a new concept in the world. A lot of times when you have some restrictions on what you can do, it does foster some creativity. But it's something to keep in mind. If you start a student with $1,000, they might want to buy Amazon, but they can't. So they need to investigate other alternatives in the same space, that kind of thing. The disadvantage is the smaller amount is it's very little wiggle room. If your students can only afford to buy one share or no shares at all of stocks that they want to invest in, then it feels like they have a restriction that, again, can discourage them from the concept of investing altogether. You don't want to do that. You want to make it so there's enough so they can actually do something. Students can also get discouraged by losing smaller amounts. So if you have students that are trying to play with cheaper stocks, so not necessarily penny stocks, but something that isn't exactly grade A investment material, just because they can buy more shares of it when they have less money, then they can get discouraged if they get a lot of volatility. This is actually the exact opposite problem of the $100,000 one, because like I said, with the $100,000 one, we see a lot of students that are only investing about $10,000 for the first part of the semester, and they're holding a lot of cash. So if something happens in their portfolio, they don't actually see much movement because most of their portfolio is still cash. So a swing in a stock price doesn't matter. For the $1,000 ones, your students are going to be fully invested all the time. So if they're overweighted in one particular stock, then their portfolio is going to swing quite a bit when that stock's price moves. So generally speaking, if you want a safer game, go with the $100,000 option. If you want to spend a little bit more time on class with it and you want to take it as far as it can go, then you might want to lower the amount quite a bit to kind of foster that creativity. Diversification rules. So this is another one that has a couple different schools of thought. So a diversification rule means that students can only invest a certain percentage of their portfolio in one single stock. So how much can go in Google versus Apple. There's some important pros here. It's starting early with the diversification latch them by giving them some training wheels. So if you say, you have you have a $100,000 portfolio, but you can only put $25,000 in each stock, then clearly they're going to be diversifying their portfolio because they don't have a choice. It forces the students to explore a bit more because they have to fill up their portfolio relatively evenly with different stocks. So both of those are good reasons why teachers like using diversification rules to force students to kind of think that way. On the other side, sometimes it's okay for a student to fail. If you have students that are over-investing in one stock in particular, then if that means their portfolios can become very sensitive to the price of that one stock. So if it goes down, then it's a very good teaching moment of, well, you should have probably diversified a little bit more and you could have gotten, a less of a hit and maybe a return somewhere else. If they get lucky, that can kind of defeat the point. If they're holding a lot of, some stock that's price jumps up, then they're going to be, gloating in front of the class saying this is why it worked because I made a risk and it paid off. That's not always a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a good thing. Diversification rule also applies pretty heavily when you start the students off with the lower amounts. So for example, if you're doing a $1,000 stock game and you have a 20% position limit, for example, that means your students would only be able to invest $200 in each stock. And that can actually cut off a lot of the world of investing. They might not be able to afford a single share of a lot of stocks they might want to play around with. So diversification rules, generally speaking, most teachers are going to want to turn them on. But again, if you want to spend more class time with it, if you really want to have a lot of discussion time with the students about what's going on in their portfolio, then you might consider turning them off or just having them set a little bit higher. That way you can let students take those risks and use them as teaching moments. So how to actually set up your class. So if you haven't done it before, I'm going to jump through that real quick here. So on howthemarketworks.com, if you have signed up already, you're going to have a teacher account, and so this is what you'll see when you log in. To create your class, you would click Create a Contest right in the middle here, which has this pop up with all of your class rules. So you give it a name, so Mr. Smith's The name can be anything as long as it's unique. So if some other teachers already use the name, you have to choose something else. The group type, this is for our analytics so we know what kinds of classes are using our site. Estimated number of users, again, this is just our internal stuff when we say, for example, I said at the beginning of this one, 500,000 students have used one of our sites in the last year. That's where we get that number from. Description, this is going to appear on the registration page for your students. So this is just another block to make sure they're in the correct class. There's a few different ways to get your students registered. I'll go over those in a few minutes. Registration window is when your students can create their portfolio, when they can first register for your class. This comes more important for classes that use How the Market Works almost exclusively as homework assignments, which you can do. That way it makes sure the students actually registered and they didn't just sign up on the last day and placed a bunch of trades. Trading period, this is where your students can actually start building their portfolio. So what's very common in the last few years is that teachers will set the trading period a little bit ahead. The students register and then they start doing those first assignments. So they'll watch the tutorial videos, they'll read some of the articles before they start trading in their portfolio. So that way everybody's on the same page and everybody's kind of starting in a level playing field. At the tournament end date here, this is when your students can't trade anymore. So on the 4 p.m. of the end date we have here, the students' portfolios get frozen in time. So they don't have to come in and sell everything off. We just freeze it. So they can log in again, and they can log in later and see what the portfolio was in the last day. Time zone, this impacts on the timestamps that are throughout the site. So we have a lot of younger students especially getting confused when everything was just in Eastern time. So you can choose whatever time zone you like. Password for students to register. So this is if you, for some reason, see students coming into your class that shouldn't be there. It's fairly rare, but you can put a password on it so that anyone who tries to join your class needs to put this password in. This usually isn't required, but if you do start seeing a lot of people you don't recognize appearing in your class game, you have the ability to kick them out, but you can also block them from registering entirely. Next up, trading rules. So this is what your stock game is going to look like. So the currency of your portfolio, US and Canadian is of course most common, but there's tons of other ones you can choose from. How much cash they start with. So $100 is for an extremely small game. $1,000, $10,000 is a very popular one. $100,000 is the most popular one, but we have everybody from across the stream here. What can students trade? So US stocks and ETFs, mutual funds, Canadian stocks and ETFs. You can even have cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies is a very contentious one. A lot of students get really into cryptocurrency trading, but it's not necessarily something that is covered in a high school personal finance or investing class. So if you want to drive a little bit of student excitement to your class, you can turn on cryptocurrencies. You can also change any of these settings throughout your class. So week 1, you can just have mutual funds, for example, and then week 2, you'll turn on stocks. The last week, you might allow cryptocurrency, something like that. Order types: short selling, day trading, margin trading. So margin trading is letting your students borrow money. When they start out, they'll have how much cash you gave them, plus they'll have another reserve amount that they can borrow from. So for example, with a $100,000 portfolio, the student would also start with $100,000 margin, so they'd have $200,000 total buying power. Once they use up their cash, they would start trading on the margin automatically, and if they do use that borrowed money, they're charged 8% interest on the loan. So that can be a pretty valuable lesson for credit. Coupling that with the very small starting cash, if you turn on margin trading, they'll get $2,000 to trade with, and then the students are going to start getting charged interest almost immediately, which can be a very good teachable moment. Require notes. These are the trade notes that I was mentioning earlier, where the students have to write something for every time they make a trade. Down here, administration. So portfolio resets. Portfolio resets lets students reset their own portfolio. So they did something wrong, something went poorly, they'll have a button that they can press to reset them back to the starting position. So generally speaking, portfolio resets are used when a teacher wants to do something called a practice period. So a practice period would be a week-long session where the students are doing those first sets of assignments. Students can start building the portfolio, but for that week they have the option of redoing it, just restarting from scratch. After that week practice period ends, the teacher turns off portfolio resets and the real game begins. Include you in the rankings. So like I said earlier, teachers that trade alongside the students and are in the rankings have a lot higher engagement in their classes, but not every teacher wants to do that. So you can turn it off and you'll still be able to log in, you'll still be able to trade and show things to your students, but you just won't appear on the rankings page. Public portfolios. With a public portfolio, every student can see each other's portfolios and trades. So again, this can be really useful for classes that you want your students to be comparing notes with each other and see what each other is doing. It can be a very good teaching experience for the students, but the downside is you don't want students to just start copying the first place student. So generally speaking, we have the same thing. During the practice period, the students they can reset their portfolio, they can see each other's holdings, and then after that practice period ends, you just turn them both off. You have a lot of flexibility with what you can do here, though. Other rules. So these are advanced rules. Not every class uses these, but you can still play around with them. So commissions. How much commission is a student charged for every trade they make? Diversification limit. The diversification limit is how much students can invest in this security type. So let's say that you want to make sure students invest at least half of their portfolio in mutual funds. You can put a diversification limit of 50% on their equities. That way they can only put half their portfolio in stocks. The rest would have to go to mutual funds. We kind of recommend against that, but you can do it. Position limit. It's the same idea, but it's for a single stock. So for position limit, a 25% position limit, students would need to buy at least 4 stocks to use up all their cash. So with the $1,000 starting balance here, a 25% position limit, the most I could put into any single stock would be $250. You can also use minimum prices to make sure your students aren't investing in penny stocks, and you can set these to whatever you'd like them to be. Once you have the rules set up, this is when you pick your first assignment. You can see these 10 items that I mentioned earlier are pre-selected. Generally speaking, teachers do the assignments by weeks. So the week 1 assignment would be these 10 things. And like I said, this is probably going to take a student about a half an hour to finish all 10 of these. They can do it at home, they can do it in class, however you want to structure your class. And then I'm going to set this to end next week. That way it's set. There's also these buttons to copy older ones, so if you have used How the Market Works before, you can just duplicate what you did before. We make your life a little bit easier. Once you have the stuff that you want your students to do, you'll click Create, and everything's set. So your class is set up. It's ready for students to register as long as you have your registration date where it needs to be. And there's 2 different ways for your students to get registered. The first one is this link. And you can see I just got an email with a copy of this information too. But this link will give your students a direct registration to your contest. So I went into an incognito window, so I'm logged out here. But the student just picks their login information, the username, password. They can enter their email address if they want to do password resets, but it's not required. We also have some data protection measures in here. For students who are under 16, they're not even allowed to enter their email address. They can just enter their first name and the first letter of their last name. So we're pretty restrictive on what kinds of information that students can put in here. If you use Google Classroom, your students can use their Google account to register and log in. The second way is to do what we call account generation. So this came up in the last year as more and more schools are very restrictive on letting students enter anything at all. We have what's called our Manage Users page. You can get here from our content. If you go to My Contests, and you'll see Manage Users, the button next to every contest. You can just say, I want 15 accounts. So my high school mascot was Knights, so that's what I'll use as the username. My students are in the 16 to 18 age range, and I want 15 student accounts. So you just press Add, and the system will give you 15 accounts. So here's the username, here's the password, just distribute to these students as you see fit. If you come back to this page, all of those accounts are going to be in here. You can edit their username, so you can change it to something else that makes more sense for you to understand, and you can reset their passwords. So you can reset the passwords of all of your students at any time. That way, if they lose their username, they can find it. From this page, you can also kick people out of your class who shouldn't be there. So a lot of your admin stuff's on this page. Otherwise, if you go to the rankings page, you can also see more buttons for your class. Let's see here. Class that I have created. So this is another class that I created. I have another set of student accounts that I created for this one. On the rankings page as the teacher, I have this view button that lets me see their portfolio, their trades, their account balances, their trade notes, all that stuff. If you turn on public portfolios, your students will have that button too, but by default, just you as the teacher has it. You also have a button to reset your students. So as the teacher, you can always reset your students, and you have a button to kick people out of your class if they shouldn't be there. So most of your admin stuff comes from these buttons here. So that's basically all it takes to set up a class. It's pretty painless. If you're not sure what to do with anything, you can just use the default settings, because that's what we set them as the defaults because that's what most teachers use. Once your class is set up, now you need to maintain it. To maintain your class, the most important thing is to keep trading. Namely, you yourself, the teacher. You should be going in and making a couple trades every week, and then you can kick off a class discussion about what you traded and why. That, again, is one of the main things that will drive student engagement. The rankings themselves are pretty good. You'll find students are going to be on their phones during other classes, checking the class rankings and making trades and stuff. But the teacher engagement is really what puts it over the top. Second, call out the top and bottom students regularly, both by their overall returns and weekly rankings. You can see on the rankings page, there's a tab here where students can see their rankings by week and by month too. So just because they're not the top right now for the whole week, the whole competition, they could still be doing really well for the last week. So the idea here is ask them why they're doing so well. Try and have students stay on top of what's going on in their portfolio too. And if they're doing well, they're probably going to want to talk about it, so that's a good thing. And use data for other class projects, particularly math classes. So having students use their portfolio is generating a very rich amount of data. They have their transaction histories that they need to use for calculating profit and loss. They have daily portfolio returns they can use for graphing. They have the changes between the weekly and monthly rankings, and they can figure out how to do those calculations. Financial math classes in particular are getting a lot of use just out of the data that they create by just regular trading. So just be aware that they can do that, and it's probably a good multidisciplinary exercise every time they do. So some advanced stuff. So if this is the first time that you have used How the Market Works, I wouldn't recommend these. But if you have in the past and your students liked it, these are some ideas for some more interesting stuff you can do with your class. First one's called multi-portfolio. So you can create 2 different class contests and have your students join both of them. If you have that registration link that I had at the beginning there, and a student clicks that when they're already logged in, they're just going to add that portfolio to an existing account, so they can have 2 classes at once. One class is a normal class, so they can trade as much as they want. The second one has a limit of 10 trades per semester. So this is called an active versus passive comparison, where students can see how they do with an active trading strategy with a passive trading strategy. So this is used quite frequently in university investments classes, because the teaching point is the students' buy and hold portfolio, where they can only make a couple trades, very often outperforms the one that they could place a lot of trades in, because they put a lot more time and effort into thinking through each and every one of those trades. The second one is called the race to the bottom. So the race to the bottom, the point of this exercise is to show students that the same skills are needed to have high returns as to have low returns. So you allow short selling, and you actually do your class rankings by who loses the most money. Because if students can both buy and short stocks, it's the exact same skills necessary to make money and lose money. So with shorting allowed, it takes you'd set your commissions to 0, and the whole point of the class is it kind of turns the concept on its head, where you're trying to have students lose the most money, and they do the same kinds of research, they do the same kinds of trades, but it makes them think about it a whole different way. Final reports. So when you start getting towards the end of the semester, you're going to have your students do the final report project. Give students at least a week to provide to go through their data and put everything together for you. But in general, the final report they're going to want to turn in should include a summary of their trading notes. They should use pie charts showing their final portfolio allocation, and use line graphs showing how their portfolio changed over time. And then the main narrative that you want them to give is what would they do differently. So, a short sentence about what worked, what didn't, but specifically what would they do differently if they had to do it all over again. And then once the students have turned in this final one, you can reopen trading. Our support team can just turn all student accounts back on. You can let them keep playing for the next year. We have a lot of classes where there's 1 or 2 students that keep trading their class portfolio over a year after their class ends, because they want to learn how to trade in the real world, and so they use that tool to do so. So if you just have your class end, it'll be frozen, but once the students turn in all their final reports, you can just ask our support team to thaw your class out, and then everybody can start trading again. So the next up is our personalfinancelab.com site. So Personal Finance Lab is a premium version of How the Market Works. It's tailored explicitly for high school and middle schools. There's no ads on it, but it is not free. So to fund the development of Personal Finance Lab, we charge about $10 per student. If you get site licenses, you can get a little bit cheaper prices. Personal Finance Lab, this is what it looks like. It's a lot faster because there's no ads on it, and it's a lot easier to use. So if I log in with my teacher account here, You can see my portfolio as soon as I log in. Oh, looks like I need to create a class first. So I'll create a class here to say what some of the differences. You have a lot more rules you can play around with. Forums are part of Personal Finance Lab. You get some of the same other rules that we had before. Some of these rules are the same, but you can also have risk-adjusted returns. So a Sharpe ratio, for example, would allow students to see rankings that are divided by volatility. So it rewards students who are more consistent with their returns. Setting that trade cap, you can also limit the number of trades students can place each day. So even if students are allowed to day trade, you can say you're only allowed to place 3 trades every day in your portfolio. Or you can have it, off and you just have them trade anything they want. Trade notes, again, this is another part of it, both sites. On the Personal Finance Lab site, there's also a lot more security types. So corporate and treasury bonds, spot contracts like currencies, options trading. If you have an agricultural program in your CTE classes, you can have them even do agricultural futures, that kind of thing. For the exchanges themselves, you can customize what your students can trade. So in the US, for example, you could say, my students are only allowed to trade companies that have a presence in the States, so the ones they know. Or you could say explicitly, I don't want my students to trade marijuana stocks. So you just list the stocks you don't want your students to trade here, and then it'll be blocked on the trading page when they go in. There's also a lot of international exchanges available for them, so there's a whole world of investing. When it comes to the assignments on Personal Finance Lab, it's a night and day difference. So Personal Finance in particular has about 70 topics covering all of the Jumpstart and National Council standards, along with just about every state standard. Sorry. There's about 30 economics topics. There's more career prep focus. There's about 70 business topics, accounting, management, marketing, everything in between. We have our Investing 101 course, where the concept in here is instead of it being one article with one quiz, we organize things into chapters that teach students how to invest. More trading stuff, same math stuff. There's assessments built into it. So at the end of all of those quizzes on Personal Finance Lab, we actually store the students' grades, and so you can use those quizzes as an actual assessment for your class. I'll skip this step for now. When it comes to trading on Personal Finance Lab, there's also a lot more information available. So let me put in my order here. Let me log into my other account. So, the symbol, the information about how the stock has moved. See, there's no ads or anything on this site, so it's a lot easier for students to use. Advanced charts that they can play around with. Company profile, who is this company, what do they do, what's Wall Street saying about this stock. They can see the financial statements, so like the income statement, balance sheet, cash flow statement. Company news, what's Wall Street saying right now. So there's a lot of advanced stuff here. One of the big changes we're making at Personal Finance Lab is that starting this spring, you can also do what's called weekly deposits. So you can have your students start out with $1,000 cash, but then every week they'll have another $500 added to their account. So they need to keep coming in and reinvesting that cash and rebalancing their portfolio to use that extra deposit. So it works a lot more like it would in the real world if somebody was investing on their own. They probably would be adding money every month or so, every paycheck. Yeah, so the other stuff that we have in here, better research, assignments and assessments built in, teacher reports. So on the Personal Finance Lab site, as the teacher, I have a ton of actual dedicated reports pages. So how many students are registered, an activity report that would show, go to a class that has some trades in it. Nope, I don't have any right now. But this one would show how often your students are logging in and placing trades in their portfolio. There's another one called the Diversification report that shows how your students' portfolios break down over time. rank report where you can actually add and remove cash from students' accounts. So you can give class participation bonuses, that kind of thing. Team report, I'll talk about that in a second. Custom reports, you can just say, I want a report that lists my student's first name, last name, email address. I want their current portfolio value. I want how many trades they've made. And I want a button to reset their password. Say, this is my report. I've actually created all the custom reports I can, and so it would load up exactly like this. So here we are. So there's the information requested, and it's all here for the teacher to use. How much if we want to set up the PFinLab and try it out before we buy student accounts? We're happy to give you a demo account. So you can come in, we can give you an access to it, and you can set up a class and play around with it. And you can use it as a teacher for a little while to see if it's something you like. So just send me an email after the webinar, and I'll be happy to set you up with one of those. And we can actually give you an actual dedicated demo of it, because I'm kind of going through everything in pretty high level. And the last thing is teams. So with the Personal Finance Lab site, you can actually put your students into teams. So every student still gets their own portfolio. They still have their own progress they're doing, but all of their stuff gets aggregated together into group portfolios with group rankings. So it becomes both an individual and a group project where there's some strategy for the team as well. With Personal Finance Lab, we also have our new budgeting game built into it. So our budgeting game, basically, it puts the students in the role of a college student with a part-time job. They start with $700 in their checking account. They start with $300 in their savings account. You control a lot of the settings in the game, like how much are they paying for rent, what is their phone bill, what is their energy bill. So all of this stuff you as the teacher control. You also control how much money they earn at their job. So you can do a balancing act to try to match things to how things actually look in your community to make it as realistic as possible. If students try to skip through these and go too fast, we actually penalize them. So they have to, do things the right way. They have a part-time job, like I said. So every month they get a set of hours allocated to them by their boss. And again, trying to skip through this, they get penalized. And the way it works is they just need to go through a fictional year. So in this one, after 2 days, I have a value proposition. So one of my friends wants to have some t-shirts, so I have an opportunity to lend him money to do it, or don't lend him money. So I'll lend him money this time, and for each of my transactions I can use my debit card coming from my checking account or my credit card coming from my credit card. So I'll give him money on my checking account. It looks like in this case I need a new coat, so it's cold out because it's already October, so I need to buy a coat. And the whole idea here is on top of those fixed expenses that your students were given, they have all of these variable expenses that come up. This is the real world where things happen. So at the end of each week, students choose how to spend their weekend. Household is taking care of chores, socialize is spending time with friends. Study is if they want to study more in school, or they can earn extra money at their job. We have it set up where students are encouraged to do all of these frequently. If they try to, for example, earn extra money over and over again and they don't study, they're going to start failing their exams, and so they're going to have to hire tutors, and it costs them a lot of money to make up for it. But for now, for the first time, I'm going to try to earn more money. We have a couple mini games built into it, just kind of to break up the game a little bit to give them something else to do. So we have this one, which is a 2048 game, and we also have another one where they actually are waiting tables at their job at a cafe. They also have things like bank statements built into it. So let me go to my older classes. You can see I have quite a few classes built into here. So for the last month I had the game, I had $1,000 in income, I had $1,400 in expenses, and that was my ending net worth. I can see my checking account, so this is basically a bank statement showing all my checking account transactions. Savings account, I had the students are encouraged to move as much money as they can to their savings account by the end of the month. Credit card transactions, all of those are visible too. So at the end of the game, it looks like I earned $16 from that game that goes to my checking account. And then at the end of the week, I get my paycheck. So this is based on the hours that I was allocated at the beginning. I have tips that I earned at my job, and I have my income tax deducted. Okay, Michelle, I will send you an email at the end of this. It's no problem. And the other stuff in the budget game that students can do, like I said, moving money to their savings account. So we highly encourage them to move as much as they can to their savings account, but we also give them warnings if their checking balance goes too low. So for example, in this week, you can see I had a lot more expenses than income, so that's a big problem that they need to be aware of. They can see their credit card statement. They can pay off their credit card at any time, but their actual credit card bill comes on the 19th, and if they don't pay it by the 26th, then they start getting charged interest. Account summary shows how things have been moving for the duration of the game, and there's a bunch of other good stuff built into the budget game too. Starting this spring, we're also going to have other modes of the budgeting game. So for example, one where your student actually has a full-time job and they're not a student. We're also working on a business version that will be used in business classes where students are managing a small business instead of their personal finances. So just like the stock game, the budget game has its own set of rankings. We do rankings in the budget game based on net worth, credit score, and the game score. So the game score goes up by maintaining a good credit score, moving money to the savings account, and some of those old boy cards that came up. Credit score is improved by using and paying off their credit card on time, and net worth is just how effectively are they able to save their money. So everything is consequence driven, where things happen in the game because of the actions the student took. So it's encouraging students to have the wise personal finance approach to the real world. But other than that, that is it for me. So before I go, does anybody have any questions? Okay, I didn't see any questions coming up. So I am going to end the webinar. Thank you very much for joining me. If you do have any questions or comments or concerns or questions about your class or things that you think that we should be adding to our best practices here, feel free to send me an email, kevin@howthemarketworks.com. This webinar will be available. We're going to post it to YouTube shortly after I finish here, and then it'll be available for viewing and download later today. So thank you for joining me. Have a lovely afternoon and a great weekend.